Hey everyone, welcome to this podcast called Ken Reads, where I, Ken, read out your letter that you've shared with me in the hopes that I can better help you understand what the F just happened between you and the last partner you were dating, whether it was in a relationship or a situationship. I look at these experiences from the lens of attachment theory. I don't just come up with thought terminating cliches like, they're just not that into you, or if they wanted to, they would. While some of those phrases might have their benefit in other dynamics, I try and look at this from the lens of, is there perhaps an insecure attachment issue that's at play in these particular dynamics? And though I am an Australian counsellor, I am not someone who is going to be responding to these letters as if I was with a client. I'm here to provide validation, yes, but I can't provide any diagnoses on these. So even if, a lot of people might understandably hear this and be like, well, that sounds like a narcissist. At best, I'll probably say, sounds a bit narky. I probably won't go any further than that out of respect to my ethical boundaries in regards to what I can and can't do. If you find this of benefit to you, fantastic. That's what I want. And if you want to submit your letter, you're very welcome to, once there is obviously availability per month. And I'll happily read out and share my own 2 cents as to what I think has gone on in your dating experience to offer you a sense of validation for what you've been through, and also to give other people listening a chance to feel like maybe this relates to what they've also experienced as part of collective healing. So with that all out of the way, let's dive in to the latest letter. For today's letter, we're reading Benjamin's story. And before I go any further, I just want to make a little disclaimer that this letter, is once again a wonderful representation of our colorful LGBTQI plus community. And on that note, I just want to say, even though Megan is joining us for today's letter reading, I didn't know this was another LGBT story. I swear I didn't just make Megan the token lesbian of the team so that way we would do these letter readings together as fellow fruit salad folk. But it just happened to be that way. So just putting that out there, don't cancel on me for making Megan the token LGBTQI plus representative alongside me, because that was not preordained. Anyways, my silliness aside, Megan, it's great to have you back.
Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for having me back. And yeah, thanks. Thank you for the disclaimer because yeah, we randomly pick letters, and I think this is the third one that happened to be about an LGBTQ couple. So yeah, it's I think it's a little bit funny, maybe some irony behind it. But yeah, they're chosen at random, folks. So don't come after us if this is concerning at all for you. But
To be fair,
yeah.
to be fair though, I think we do a pretty good job. Like, I mean, I feel like we're still very warm, validating, appreciative, and I mean, it coincidentally, this has been probably the third time in a row this has happened, but you know, stranger things have happened.
Very true. Very true. Did you want me to introduce myself? Say a little bit about me?
Yes, please.
All righty. Yeah. So, as Ken already said my name, I'm Megan. I am part of Ken's team with Ken Reed Counseling. So, with Ken, I work as a coach. I help individuals process abrupt and often traumatic breakups if they were with somebody that had a severe attachment woundings. I help folks process those relationships. I help folks to work on healing their own respective insecure attachment styles. And I also can support individuals in putting some context or some understanding to a relationship where their ex struggled with an addiction of some kind, including things like sex, pornography, gambling addictions. So I do that with Ken part-time on the team here as a coach. And full-time, I am a registered social worker with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. And I am an addiction counselor in my small town, rural Ontario community. And I specialize in behavior addictions working there. So that's where I see folks primarily that have addictions like sex and pornography and gambling addictions, binge eating, tech addiction, uh, video game use, hoarding, shopping and spending. So that's what I do full time there. And for many, many years, I also worked frontline in the field of domestic violence. And especially if folks are maybe newer to the stuff that Ken does, we are starting to talk more about how not all the time, but sometimes these relationships with folks that have some really, really significant attachment woundings can be abusive. So also having that knowledge working in domestic violence and seeing it play out in these relationships, I can also help support folks understanding that, putting context to it, and yeah, just continuing to talk about that and help people heal and move forward in their life. So those are some of the things that I do with Ken.
Yes, and like I've said many times before, your background and education are extremely invaluable in helping to understand a lot of this because, as I've said many times when we've, been together, this stuff is also highly addictive for many reasons. Okay, let's get into Benjamin's letter.
All
Benjamin
right.
writes, hello, here's another confusing story of me, Benjamin, and Phil, my ex. Phil went to boarding school when he was young and lost his mother a few years ago. He mentioned many family issues and struggles with low self-esteem, obsessive compulsive disorder, and anxiety. He also uses sex, cocaine, and smokes cigarettes for stress. He has a high-paying career and overloads with work often. My mother left when I was young, but later returned, most likely creating an anxious attachment style in myself. I'm also in the Air Force and get paid decently. Kevin appears to be another fun party friend who is going to be part of this story down the line. And something that we need to know about Kevin is that he also does cocaine and smokes regularly. He's always looking for superficial fun. There's no info on Kevin's career, and I will introduce Kevin later into my story between Phil and myself. So, considering that this letter is not alongside for us, I'm happy to pause a bit more frequently with this and just sort of take stock of everything. And already we have, well, as we would probably have in our case notes, we have a few presenting issues, to say the least. What are your thoughts on this, Megan?
I think you said it well. We have a few presenting issues here in the first paragraph of the letter. And I mean, looking at it too, and also for folks, again, maybe if you're a little bit newer to watching Ken and the content and his team engaging with everybody, you'll hear me talk about how, in a nutshell, addiction is a maladaptive coping strategy to help us regulate our emotions and help to just manage trauma and pain within us. So, and I also want to preface addiction is incredibly complex. It is not black and white. Addiction is not a choice that people make. So there's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of complexities to it, but just in that nutshell for people to just reflect on or keep at the forefront of their mind, especially as we're going through this letter, is that it is just a way to regulate his emotions. And oftentimes when we look at addiction or addictive behaviors or substances, at one time it did work. At one time that was a coping strategy, or or I shouldn't say or, and before addictions take hold, they often start out as something that is fun, that is pleasurable, or that they recognize as numbing, and nobody ever thinks that they are going to develop an addiction. So I bring that up to preface that because there's a lot of substance use. Sex can also be addictive. I work with a lot of people who struggle with sex addiction. I see it with my coaching clients here with you, Ken. They had relationships with people that had sex or pornography addictions, and this guy Phil is just using sex and substances and partying and fun to avoid a lot of pain. I see that very well. And also he has a high paying career. Um, I'm guessing that the high paying career means he probably lives for his job. I can imagine he spends most of his day at work or involved with work if he's not at the office. To also just escape his feelings. Work can be very addictive. Work can be codependent. People can also um, try and find their value based on their work, self validation. And we see that a lot with folks that struggle with avoidant, or I take that back, not just avoidant, any insecure attachment style. So I I do see that. And his buddy Kevin probably is someone who doesn't hold him accountable, who's probably dysfunctional like Phil, and they can be dysfunctional together. So I know that was a lot, but those are my thoughts on the first paragraph.
Your thoughts are fantastic. And I completely agree with the relationship between Phil and Kevin, which is the fact that when you've got friends who do the same thing as you and they enable it, the danger is that they don't call you out on the stuff when it gets problematic. So there is that aspect. And I agree with you. He's married. Like, I reckon Kevin is probably married to his work, amongst other things. I'm just going to say, if you ever get a whiff that someone's a workaholic, in my opinion, it's a huge red flag, because I know workaholism is, well, at least in my world, it's not something we take very seriously. It was sort of just like, oh, you're such a workaholic. Like, it's a bit of a throwaway thing, right? But it's actually one of the biggest coping mechanisms for people who don't want to get emotionally invested in someone at a deep, intimate level, because they're scared, essentially, amongst other things. And as a consequence, it means that they're really not going to give you the intimacy that you're craving in a relationship. It'll only stay at a certain level. So there's that. The fact that Phil went to boarding school when he was young and lost his mum a few years ago, and he's got all this other presenting stuff with the drugs, the sex, makes me think, I am thinking we're leaning in the territory of someone who, at the very least, has something dismissive going on, because boarding school, emotional neglect, lost his mum a few years ago, that wouldn't have helped. So I imagine that maybe has also inflicted some abandonment wounds on him as well too. So yeah, he could very well be a dismissive leaning FA or a dismissive avoidant outright. But one thing's for sure,
I would, oh, I'm
man,
sorry, go on, Ken.
yeah, it's all good. I was gonna say, man's definitely got some trauma.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's also dismissive leaning in some way. And again, just kind of bouncing back to your point about, your buddy Kevin, we also see a lot with our clients, or again, people who submit letters, or just people who talk about their experiences, folks that have that really, really severe insecure attachment wounding. I think a big part of why it's there are because of the people, not why it's there, but why it's maintained to an extent, is because of the people they hang out with. They are going to hang out with people that don't call them out on their bullshit, they don't call them out on their behavior, that don't question them, that they continue to enable it, be it friends, family, coworkers. Because if somebody says, hey, I don't like your behavior, why are you doing that? Are you sure X, Y, and Z happen? They don't like that. They don't want to hear it. So they would rather leave and go find other people to spend time with than being called out. So I think that's also a big reason why, if they're really, really severe in their attachment style, they're not changing, they will find people that will enable them. So Kevin is probably a big enabler, and um anybody that tries to challenge them, they're not going to be in their life for very long.
Completely agree with everything you said. So let's continue with Benjamin's letter. He writes, from 2019 to 2021, Phil and I were friends with benefits. Between January 2022 and November 2022, our relationship dynamic changed to a relationship. He decided the title. I simply belong. Now, during this time, we shared enjoyable moments like dates and movies, great sex, and Phil invested in our time together. When conflicts arose, he would often choose to take breaks rather than discuss the issues. Okay, a bit of avoidance showing up. After the honeymoon phase was over, the personal issues arose and he ended things about 11 months in. After our breakup in November of 2022, I lost control of my anxious attachment style and ended up getting blocked by Phil. 2 months later, I sought forgiveness and forced a meet at a local sex store, which I know is a red flag, and try to express my pain of him abruptly breaking things off by text, rekindling contact in 2023. From February to April, our communication was minimal. In May, we met but didn't have sex. But did not have sex at Phil's suggestion, and I agreed. He wanted a friends with benefits situation, which I accepted, but I explained I wanted to try again. Between June and October, we engaged in sexual activities and occasional dates without a defined relationship title. He even took me to a fancy restaurant for my birthday and spent hundreds to make a great night. Still wary, I questioned Phil's intentions, and he was unable to provide me answers, leading to a further push and pull dynamic. He then often expressed not being able to meet my needs. During this time, I also learned about Phil's past infidelities and wondered if he desired an open relationship, which he denied. In January 2024, I decided to move on and block Phil, but Phil did not want this separation, and his friends contacted me, prompting eventual communication. After a work trip, we met again in February, but struggles continued until May, when I blocked Phil again out of frustration. Let's take a pause here. We've already got a few signs of extreme hot and cold behavior from each of you, and I'm keen to address Benjamin's anxious attachment in a hot minute. But before I mention anything, Megan, what are your thoughts on this saga that's unfolded?
Yeah, and I was going to say I want to also touch on Phil's anxiety. Yeah, or Phil's anxiety.
Do you mean Kevin's
Or
anxious attachment?
yes, thank you.
Sorry, not Kevin, Benjamin. Benjamin.
Benjamin, both of us. Folks, it's late. We've had a long day. We apologize. Yes, I'll let you touch on that after I just butchered that part there. Sorry, man. But looking at it, I think that Phil more than likely is probably a dismissive leaning, fearful avoidant. And the reason why I say that is something that's really standing out to me is the amount of sexual engagement and sexual behaviors that are outlined from Phil in this letter, even meeting at a sex shop. I don't think I've ever encountered, whether it's a client or another letter reading, where a situation like this has happened. And the reason why I say that is when we look at folks that are dismissive leaning, fearful avoidant, as opposed to just a dismissive avoidant, a lot of folks that tend to have dismissive leaning, fearful avoidant attachment styles will be more hypersexual. And I do often see that in the work that I do with individuals who are either coming in as a coaching client to work on their own respective attachment styles, or again, folks at my full-time job, quite a few of them I see for sex addictions tend to be fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment. And the reason why we can often see that is folks that have that fearful avoidant attachment style often find validation or it's more validation in sex and sexual behaviors. They will kind of gravitate towards that to try and feel better about themselves. Or we can see that they will engage in sex to have a good time, to release sexual, or not sexual, to release like kind of be like a stress reliever, but they don't really use it for intimacy, connection building, vulnerability, like to be vulnerable. It's more for that gratification, feels good, be creative in the bedroom, be kind of spicy in the bedroom, perhaps. But it's more to just blow off steam and to try and feel good about themselves, as opposed to, again, that intimacy part. And when we talk about folks, if you have an addiction of some kind, we use the 4 C's. If there's a factors of control, if there's compulsion, if there's cravings, if there is, the fourth one, consequences. If those are the 4 C's that are present, or if there's binging involved with the 4 C's, when we look at addiction, that can be indicative. And there's a whole scale that we use to measure where somebody sits. We call it the spectrum of use, but all of that is really what we would need to look at before somebody can say we have an addiction present. So I preface that to say I know there's a lot of sexual behaviors, but not enough to say if he's got a sex addiction, but clearly problematic sexual behaviors, because I really see this man leaning into it to escape pain and feelings. And also conflicts. Conflicts are arising. He can't talk about it. He just left. He just tried to sweep things under the rug. Any type of personal issues that arose was never resolved. And I even wonder for the person who wrote this letter, he, it was probably things that were fairly minor that would have been easily able to work through. Or maybe some of these conflicts he blocked, he just walked away from conversation. There was no ability from Phil to help Benjamin work through conflict. Like he couldn't deal with it because he doesn't have those skills of communication that was never modeled to him growing up to be able to just work through conflict like we can in healthy relationships. So yeah, I think there's a lot more that I can say, but I feel like I've talked enough. So Ken, what are your thoughts for the rest of this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. One is that it appears, exactly as you said, that Phil struggles to navigate conflict because it appears that any time that happens, as you said, he sweeps it under the rug. I guess my attention is actually turning in the direction of Benjamin because you mentioned how you lost control of your anxious attachment style, which makes me wonder, were you trying to like keep that under wraps throughout this entire time? Did it maybe flare up when you were with Phil? But it's like based on the way you've written it, it sounds to me as though it truly was the case that the cat was let out of the bag and there was no putting it back in again, that it was something where you probably have been sitting on that for quite some time. You've also mentioned too that you're no stranger to inconsistency, hot and cold behavior because of your mum who left and came back into your life when you were a kid. So that's significant. But it does sound to me as though when it was, as you said, out of your control, you ended up getting blocked by Phil, which is, sounding like he freaked out and he chose to protect himself. Although I find it very odd that, okay, we already suspect that Phil's got an avoidant attachment of some kind, and I agree with you, Megan. I think this is, at the very least, leaning in the direction of a dismissive, leaning, fearful, avoidant. I'd even go so far as to say that maybe if it's not just a dismissive, but that's semantics at this stage. I think that what is clear is that there's no boundaries from Phil in terms of saying, you know what, I blocked you. I don't want to have a bar of you. I wish you all the best. Goodbye. Unless I see XYZ behavior, I just don't want to engage with this. It seems like, after you you sought forgiveness, it's interesting how, you know, he's been okay seemingly to come back with you. And look, I'm not about to judge you for, forcing him to meet a local sex store. Listen, a lot of people have done similar stuff too. Is it the healthiest thing to do? No, but you've admitted it. You say it's a red flag. But it sounds to me like this is a real case of Phil got triggered by personal issues. You got triggered by him pulling away as abruptly as he did. In order to self-soothe, you've obviously forced a meet at the local sex store. And it does seem like since November 2022, all the way to rekindling in 2023, I wouldn't be surprised if you're in a lot of pain and agony off the back of that. Sounds pretty gnarly to me. Now, in regards to everything that was happening after the fact, again, I find it highly odd that Phil feels it's okay to take you out and spend hundreds of dollars on your birthday, in a very, what seems like a bit of a datey sort of experience. And he's also refusing to define the relationship title. and it's interesting how he often expressed not being able to meet your needs, which is classic sort of dismissive leaning sort of stuff to hear. To me, it just sort of seems like he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to have you around, but not necessarily have anything more intimate. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe the reason he's being a little bit more cagey at this particular point in time is because maybe he got a bit scared when, those personal issues arose back in 22 and he blocked you after your anxious attachment flared up. That's just an assumption. I could be completely wrong. But I think the reason I'm sharing that is because sometimes with avoidance, when they boomerang back, usually the intensity can be doubled before the abrupt ending happens again. But it seems like Phil has been a bit more wary on this occasion. And then finally, in January 2024, you decide to block Phil, and yet he doesn't want to lose you. And so he's got friends who are contacting you. I think that definitely speaks to the fearful avoidance side, that fear of abandonment. But yeah, I mean, and you blocking Phil out of frustration again just screams to me that obviously this situation isn't working for you. Benjamin, I know you say you lost control of your anxious attachment, but I'm almost wondering if you might actually be an anxious leaning fearful avoidant, because that inclination to block so readily makes me think, it doesn't sound like the distress of this relationship, particularly around Phil's hot and cold behavior, sat well with you. But yeah, before I move on, Megan, did you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I think looking at the letter, something that also stood out to me was when Phil, you reconnected, when Phil reconnected with you, Benjamin, and he took you out right for this fancy restaurant for your birthday and spent a lot of money. Ken, I wonder what your thoughts are, but I wonder if a part of it is, yes, he definitely, there's boomeranging back around. There's no denying that. But I wonder if this was um, Phil's way of maybe trying to, in a bit of a half-assed way, apologize, or if he really did want to try and reconnect. But you said he's very wary about the reconnection, and he still wanted to give it a shot anyway. But I kind of wonder if it was a bit of a half-assed way of apologizing and just again sweeping his behavior under the rug because he doesn't want to acknowledge it. He doesn't want to confront the shame of his actions and try to make up for it without ever addressing what was going on. I don't know. What do you think about that? If you think I'm missing the point, please let me know.
Yeah, with regards to whether this is an apology or not, my answer is it could be. I mean, it just seems like a bit of an over-generous gesture, especially considering the fact that they're not dating again officially. And I'm presuming at this point there's no sex. And also, Phil's insisted that there's no sex as well too when they connected at the sex shop as well too. So to me, I'm thinking, you know, this is a very sort of controlled way of managing intimacy whilst also doing a very sort of gift givey sort of thing for Benjamin. So yeah, short answer is maybe, but again, it just feels a bit emotionally loaded to do that, and a bit if it's truly just friendship, like it just seems a bit much, is my opinion on it. So I can understand if that was a source of confusion. Anyways, let's continue with the letter. So after the final block, I noticed Phil immediately spending more time with his previous partner, Kevin. Oh, I didn't realize that Kevin was actually the previous partner. I thought it was just a mutual friend. Okay, so
Same. Okay.
so that changes things up quite a bit. So Phil continued
Alrighty.
to reach out for conversations while involved with Kevin, which confused me. I finally gave him the space and independence he wanted. When we finally talked in November of 24, Phil admitted to partying and seeing other people oh my God, during our time apart. He came clean about a lot, mentioning rekindling with Kevin, and I then inquired about them, and he assured me nothing was happening between them. He described it as a weird on-off again situationship where he didn't even know what they truly had going on. I told him,
Bullshit.
yeah, I feel the same way.
Sorry.
I told him I wanted a relationship, and if he couldn't deliver, it was okay. He agreed and said he wanted me as well. After a few meetups in December, we went on another work trip and immediately started looking for encounters on a gay hookup site. Okay, so now this is going into a bit more of an open relationship.
I again confronted Phil about his need for casual hookups, which he ignored me completely. I expressed my willingness to discuss the possibility of an open relationship. No reply. I crossed a boundary and went to his house and talked when he returned. He expressed the holidays and family issues had him stressed and he needed space. Unfortunately, I learned that Kevin was immediately invited over the next night, and this brought me to the final discard. Okay, well, I'm keen to read about the final discard in a minute, but I feel like, man, this has escalated very quickly, and it seems like Phil, I mean, I'll be honest, like, I was curious as to whether or not Benjamin's, you know, anxious tendencies had come up in moments in his relationship with Phil, but it sounds like, based on this letter, it really only hit the fan at the end. But to me, I feel like even though obviously a lot's happened outside of the relationship together, things are now starting to seem like Phil's got a potential sex problem. At the very least, he doesn't have, you know, he's not very clear about what he wants in a relationship because he seems to go from wanting monogamy, saying he wants that, yet still seemingly desiring casual sex. So this is very confusing.
I was gonna say, oh my God. And I know in the middle of it, I just went, bullshit. And that is the hill I'm gonna die on for this letter. So Mr. Kevin or Benjamin in this case, we got a buffer here. So I think Kevin is that buffer. He's that safety person. I get to go back to Kevin when I want to, have sex without a lot of emotion, the fun stuff. I can do what I want. And then I can boomerang back to Benjamin when I maybe need some type of intimacy. So and when he said there was nothing going on between them, I don't buy that, not for a moment. Um, and he said he's having a weird on again, off again situationship. That's a type of relationship that is something going on. So if your ex-partner says, "Oh yeah, like I went back to my ex," or even just another person, or I met somebody else, but there was nothing going on. But if there is things we do in a relationship, there's something going on, and it's a way for folks with significant attachment woundings to try and, again, as you say, can have their cake and eat it too, try to have a relationship, but it not be deep. So, oh, there's so much going on here. And I think Benjamin too, I know you said, right, you're anxious, you crossed a line, and I hear in many moments throughout the letter when you do have Phil back, you are trying to hang on to him so, so tightly. And I see that you again have awareness of his behaviors and what's going on, and you're really struggling to end that relationship. And then some of the blocking that we talked about earlier in the letter, I do agree with Ken. I think those points, wondering about an anxious, leaning, fearful, avoidant attachment style for you, maybe not as severe as Phil, but I definitely think that is there. And man, this I see how hard this is for both of you. And I do have a lot of empathy for what's going on. And I know that this isn't easy for either of you. And you've been through a lot with this relationship, Benjamin. So, um, yeah, and with Kevin coming back in the picture, that's just, oh God, that's awful. It's, you didn't do anything to deserve how, Kevin, like having Kevin come in this relationship as well. So I also wanted to highlight that, like, there's just so many things going wrong here. So that's what I have to say, Ken. Or
I,
yeah, that's what I have to say, Ken.
no, I completely agree. To be honest, this feels like I'm reading about a slow moving train wreck as it's happening, like for everyone involved. And I want to say, Benjamin, I'm sorry you're going through this. To your credit, I love your contrition and also your ability to recognize when you reckon you've crossed boundaries, had anxious attached
Hmm.
moments. I love the fact that you just seem to be wanting to be like, I have the humility to realize I've done my own part in this particular relationship. Like to me, it really reads as though, you're not just making it seem like, oh, it's all on Phil and by extension Kevin. It seems like you are owning like where you feel like, okay, this is what happened and I can see how it led up to these particular things. But I think what I'm hearing too is that this relationship is something where, you know, because of each other's attachment wounding, it feels a lot more murky than other letters we've read, which is to say, it sounds like obviously your attempts to get closer to Phil in the beginning, where the personal issues arose, led to him pulling away, which led to you having a huge anxious trigger. And then obviously he didn't seem to want to, be done with the relationship due to his fears of abandonment. And also your fears of abandonment, I think, also merged that together. It seems like the connection was still there. Meanwhile, he's also been seeing Kevin on the side, probably to create, as you say, a buffer between the two of you. But to me, I just feel like this is a really tricky situation where I could easily see, parts of this, Benjamin, for you where you might hold yourself accountable for a lot of stuff and feel like, man, if only I hadn't acted anxiously in this moment, if I hadn't gone to his home, maybe things would have been different. And I want to say, I know so many people beat themselves up over this sort of stuff. And whilst I think it's good to own up to the parts of us that have caused potential issues, I also want to say that it's also not easy working with a partner who has their own share of baggage, because that is still going to trigger even the most secure person to behave in lopsided ways. Let's read the final paragraph, which is about the final discard. I questioned Kevin's real role and about the need for space, yet having Kevin over for days at a time. Then I learned that his need for space was because he had a leisure trip planned with Kevin. He completely gaslit me and expressed my actions are the reason for so much space. He proceeded to take the trip with Kevin and told me to take care and that he loved me. I changed my phone number and blocked him on social media. However, I'm struggling to regain my strength while feeling insignificant watching Phil and Kevin share a seemingly revitalized relationship. They seem to be doing tons of open relationship things, which further confused me because he never could answer whether he wanted that with me. With me, he always seemed to keep me at such a distance, as well as constantly shutting down after progress between us. I watched your video on the boomerang avoidant, and I can't help but wonder if Phil will return after this cloud, and can't seem to stop wondering about if he's happy and whether they'll make it. This final paragraph, I think, really speaks to some of the stuff I was saying. I know that Phil's saying he gaslit, sorry, Benjamin, you reckon Phil gaslit you and expressed that your actions are the reason for so much space? I rarely ever do this, but I'm going to play a little devil's advocacy based on the letter, to say there is a possibility that he actually has done that, because based on the first portion of what's shared, it seems like, you know, it's not necessarily like you were trying to do anything unreasonable in getting him to talk about his personal stuff and to also work through conflict. But it does seem like some of those actions may have been the basis for him needing space to get Kevin back in the picture, to create a buffer between the two of you. However, the way he's gone about it sounds to me like he's lobbing all of this on you. It's all your actions for so much space, which I don't like. And I think that's entirely inappropriate. So I think maybe it's a case of him speaking what I call half truths, where he's conflating the entirety of his relationship stress on you rather than considering how his own actions have contributed to you acting understandably stressed out as a consequence. There's a lot more to say on this too, but I wanted to say one thing very quickly, which is I'm so sorry you've gone through this, because, this just sounds so painful and a real case of trauma meets trauma, and that also begetting trauma and trauma for both of you.
I was going to say, Ken, I think you hit the nail on the head there, and I think you articulated that way better than I could have. I think there also were some half truths, as you said very well, based on the information in the letter. And also, again, kind of circling back to what you said earlier, Ken, and I know I'll share this with clients as well. You could be the most secure person in the whole world. And if somebody's behaviors are so hot and cold, ambivalent, lots of gaslighting going on, a lot of mixed signals, and just really, really immature and abusive behavior, going to make anybody anxious. Anybody is going to go from, again, whatever, a 5 out of 10 to a 20 out of 10. So I hear a lot of exasperation of an anxious attachment wounds coming up. And I think there were some half truths because of also maybe how tight you were trying to hold on to the relationship when Phil was present. And again, it's not blaming you, it's not shaming you in any way. It's just something that I think Ken and I both noticed is going on. And the last point, are you a boomerang avoidant, wondering if he will return? Possibly, maybe. And you're saying he's wondering if if he's happy and they will make it. And I tell this to my coaching clients. I talk about it here when I come on and do lives with Ken and podcasts. If they are with somebody, if the person you are dating has some significant attachment woundings and they hop into the next relationship and they look like they are happy and living their best life and they found the love of their life and they're doing all the things that they said they wanted to do with you and they are now doing that with somebody else, it doesn't mean that that person was better. That person on some level is probably just as dysfunctional as your ex partner is. Um, and I think again, I don't know if I don't mean for this to sound harsh, but it's like, if someone's that dysfunctional and that abusive, it's okay to have to let them go. That's someone you don't deserve to be with. They need help. And stuff, if you're going to work on some stuff for you, they need to work on a lot for them. And if they will make it, it doesn't mean it's going to be a happy, healthy, thriving relationship. It's probably one that's filled with stress, anxiety, misery, hot and cold behaviors. That's what these relationships look like when they last long term and they get married and have kids and or do whatever they talked about long term that makes them happy, but they're not happy. These are not great relationships in the long run.
The fact that he's also needing, a lot of drugs, sex, particularly sex in this instance, and parting with someone like Kevin suggests to me that this is not the kind of relationship where he's thriving with intimacy. The fact that they're now doing an open relationship makes me think that this isn't a relationship where there is a significant amount of emotional intimacy at all. I know
Yeah.
there can be so much self-blame being like, well, how could they do it with them if they couldn't do it with me? Maybe for Phil, he truly wanted to be with you, but also getting close meant that he needed to also find other people, on dating apps to feel more comfortable. And it seems like as round 2 and 3 occurred, he obviously had Kevin in the picture as well too to try and mitigate some of that closeness with you as well. So I think in the beginning, it may have been that he attempted monogamy, but as things progressed and he obviously retreated for space, that's when things opened up a bit more for him and other people as well too. But I really think that it's very easy to assume that he and Kevin must be doing so much better now because they've had history, they knew each other, and they're now doing this amazing sounding thing. Well, amazing is subjective. They're doing this open relationship, which he never wanted to do with me. It doesn't mean that you've screwed up. It doesn't mean that you've done something wrong necessarily, that, he's punishing you for this. It just means that right now he needs to be with someone where he probably has a great deal of emotional space. And I think Kevin provides that for him because I don't imagine a fellow addict in this context is really going to trigger him quite the same way as being more vulnerable with you did.
Yeah, and I also want to add just that the last point here from me for this letter, just also again circling back to Kevin, I think something that's different between you, Benjamin, and Kevin is that if folks need to constantly either be using substances, whether that's drugs or alcohol, or again engaging in things, again in this case, a lot of sexual behaviors to just get by every day, you are living in a state of disassociation. When you have to inebriate yourself in some way to get by, you are already living in a state of disassociation and you can't function. So you need to do something that's addictive, again, whether that be behaviors or substances, to numb out because you are already, again, not fully present, and it's due to trauma. That's not a choice somebody is making. So Kevin, it sounds like, also functions that way too. And again, Benjamin, based on the letter, it sounds like that's not something that you engage in to just get by every day. And I can imagine you can, as again, being in the Air Force. So that, I think, can also play into why on some level this was a really like this was a hard relationship for Phil, because you two are at different levels of awareness. You're, you don't have to manage your day-to-day lives, your day-to-day life in a state of disassociation that requires numbing out. So I can also see that was hard for him, and Kevin behaves the same way as Phil. So that's also why they probably can do better together, because they're both in that same level of wounding where you are not, Phil. So yeah, that's what I have to add as well for this letter.
And I'll round out here too by saying, I know you ask, and I know Megan's answered this too. Will he potentially return after this cloud? Possibly. I'm going to conclude here and say I actually feel this guy, Phil, does give me more dismissive, avoidant vibes than purely fearful, avoidant vibes, which makes me think, if I'm completely honest, I think that whilst he's obviously shared he loves you and that, he has boomerang back around, I'd say right now the chances are low because he's obviously, I think, getting some space from you. But I don't want to close down that opportunity. Well, I don't want to call it an opportunity. I just want to say I don't want to say no completely because, you know, it's clear there's unfinished business there for him. Doesn't mean that he'll finish that business anytime soon. Who knows? Avoidant attach is going to be very slow to regulate things. So I'd say, short answer, I have no idea, like, how long it's going to take him, if that's even a thing that will happen. Nevertheless, I am sorry you've gone through this because I really feel for both of you because I think that this has been a very painful experience where there's obviously been connection there, but it just sounds to me like, it was two attachment styles that just didn't unfortunately have the safety behind them, which is neither of your fault necessarily. I do think reading this, whilst obviously, Benjamin, you got your work to do and you've got that, that stuff's cut out for you. You got to do that. I do think Phil's got a lot of other things he's got to work on. And frankly, I'm just going to say it. If someone is an addict, their first love is never going to be you. It's always going to be their substances. I just don't think he's actually ready to even commit to the relationship that you started. And I think he was over his head given his circumstances. All right. Thank you, Benjamin, for submitting this letter. This was another great read. And again, I always love reading letters from people within the LGBT community on the basis that even though the accounts have the same pattern of stuff going on, it's always so good to get these stories just for a bit of a representation of the reality of how difficult our dating stories can be, compared especially to heteronormative dating, which obviously has its struggles. I'm not going to discount that. But we have, some unique challenges, particularly with, homophobic behavior, with, a tendency to rely on open relationships as if free love is a thing that is just an entitlement for us instead of actually engaging in proper, healthy, intimate relationships, etc. In any case, I'm just going to round up my piece here. Megan, was there anything else you wanted to add in your closing remarks for today's episode?
Yeah, definitely. And I just wanted to also touch on, the point you made of, seeing that, or sorry, letters that are submitted by folks that are part of the LGBTQ community. It's kind of variety when we look at these relationships. And I was talking about this with a client, a coaching client, a couple of days ago. When we look at attachment woundings, it it our attachment woundings will transgress our sexual orientation, cultures, um, socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter where we are in the world, who we love, how much money we make, our upbringing, like, experiences, so to speak. attachment theory doesn't have bounds, doesn't have limits on it. So I think that's something that's also really amazing, and it speaks to how this really is can happen for anybody, for people that kind of question the legitimacy of attachment work. It doesn't it has no boundaries to it for who it affects. So that's something I think I also really love working on with folks with attachment work, is that it's everywhere. So I have that's kind of what I wanted to end with the letter with that. But if folks are interested in working with me, I do have space for clarity calls and for coaching clients. I do work with Ken on Mondays and Tuesdays. As I said, this is part-time. Um, and I see folks globally. I'm in Eastern Standard Time Zone. And I also really want to emphasize too that with Ken, you are seeing me as a coach. You're not seeing me as a social worker. You are not seeing me as a therapist. You're not seeing me as a counselor. So if folks have questions about that, you can definitely reach out and ask. But coaching capacity, I have it. And if you are interested, please reach out, and we'll see if we can make something work.
Yep. And outside of that, guys, I'll be back again. Sorry, English. I will be back again to do more letter readings with the team over the next couple of weeks. So I look forward to doing that. And if you're interested in submitting a letter, anything between 500 to 2,000 words can be submitted for the final week of February. The submissions will be open again for just 4 submissions going into March, which will be open from 8 a.m. Sydney, Australia time on Friday, the 28th of February. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for participating in another very, very engaging letter reading, and I will speak with you again very soon.